Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. With that, a gravitational force erupted out that caused the more than 100 ghosts in the building to vanish as they were pulled into Bai Xiaochun's bag of holding. Having accomplished that, Bai Xiaochun's eyes glittered as he went to work clearing out the entire brothel. The floor tiles, chairs, tables, candles, and everything else that could be taken away was soon gone. In the end, it was nothing more than an empty shell, and Bai Xiaochun's heart was pounding as he thought of the gains he had made. Of course, he didn't forget the delicious food and fine wine. After scanning the entire area with divine sense, he found that whatever race of people had once existed here had plenty of hidden reserves. Licking his lips, he took it all, and then scanned the surrounding ruins one last time to make sure he hadn't missed anything. Feeling very pleased, he returned to the fan to find Bai Xiaochi waiting for him, an envious look on his face. Without any further ado, they turned the fan and headed off into the distance. By this point, the brothel's spell formation wasn't working anymore, and therefore, they easily escaped the area. As the fan flew through the void, and as Bai Xiaochun sat there cross-legged, continuing to work on the formula for 30-colored flame, court was being held back in the Arch-Emperor dynasty in the eternal immortal domains. During times when Bai Xiaochun wasn't present, matters of national concern were handled by Zhou Zimo, Song Junwan, Hu Xiaomei, the Grand Heaven Master, the Giant Ghost King, Li Qinghao, and Gong Sun Waner. Dabao had long since grown up, and acted his part as Bai Xiaochun's heir. He wasn't impulsive and belligerent like he had been when he was young, although his fundamental personality hadn't changed. As far as his cultivation base went, he had made shocking progress, and was already in the demigod realm. In terms of fleshly body, even the Giant Ghost King had to admit that his grandson was probably the toughest person he had ever met, other than Bai Xiaochun. Xiaoxiao's cultivation base was a bit higher than Dabao's. However, she had spent most her time in recent years in secluded meditation. With more and more celestials, the Arch-Emperor dynasty's foundation grew stronger and stronger. However, because it was public knowledge that Bai Xiaochun was in seclusion, rumors began to spread. The talk wasn't heard in the Arch-Emperor dynasty, but rather, in the Saint Emperor dynasty and Vile Emperor dynasty. According to the rumors, Bai Xiaochun actually didn't have Archean-level battle prowess. Instead, he had paid a huge price to come out on top in the conflicts of the past, and as a result, had been forced to spend the time afterward in meditation. It was true that he had occasionally come back to spend time with Xiaoxiao, Dabao, and the rest of his family. However, most of his time was spent on his research and his travels in the void. Sometimes, he would only come back once in an entire year, and wouldn't stay for very long when he did. The gossip is most abundant in the Vile Emperor dynasty, the Grand Heaven Master said. There is definitely someone intentionally spreading the rumors. If His Majesty doesn't make a public appearance soon, I fear it will lead to troublesome developments. Most important of all is His Majesty's cultivation base. At the moment, everyone was trying to come up with a plan for what to do next. Bai Xiaochun hadn't visited for several years now, and no one knew about the fact that he was now an Archean. And because he was so determined to succeed with 30-colored flame as soon as possible, he hadn't taken the time to check in on the situation back home. Even as everyone in the Grand Hall frowned and tried to think of good suggestions about what to do, a massive, rumbling boom filled the sky above. It sounded like heavenly thunder, and it didn't just affect the Arch-Emperor dynasty. The Saint Emperor dynasty and Vile Emperor dynasty also experienced the same thing. All of the eternal immortal domains were filled with the deafening sound. Massive waves rolled across the eternal sea as the entire world shook. At the same time, everyone felt an incredible pressure descending from the heavens. What's going on? Heavens! What is that sound? Countless people all over the world were thrown into alarm. At the same time, the most powerful experts in the three imperial dynasties flew out into the open and looked up into the sky. That was the origin of the sound. To everyone's shock, the enormous sovereign who had existed for countless years without ever moving, had suddenly moved. His eyes had twitched. All of the powerful experts could sense it, and it immediately caused all of their minds to reel. The giant moved. I'm not seeing things, am I? He actually twitched. How could this be? The legends are actually true. The Saint Emperor and the Vile Emperor flew out at almost the same time, and hovered above their respective imperial cities. A somber look could be seen in the Saint Emperor's eyes, whereas a mysterious glow was visible in the Vile Emperor's. Even as all of the countless cultivators looked on, hearts pounding with sensations of deadly crisis, the twitching of the enormous sovereign's eyes caused more than 100 boulders to dislodge from his forehead and shoot down toward the eternal immortal domains like meteors. They moved with incredible speed and even seemed to be self-aware. No matter how quickly the Saint Emperor and the Vile Emperor reacted, they couldn't block them all. Massive booms echoed out from the ground below from the impacts of those that made it through. Without the slightest hesitation, the Saint Emperor issued orders to his people. All celestials and all demigods will immediately search the Saint Emperor dynasty for those fallen rocks. If any of them seem to be alive, destroy them. Similar orders were passed down in the Vile Emperor dynasty, except that instead of ordering any living things to be destroyed, they were to be collected. Soon, both of the dynasties were fully mobilized. Even the sea areas were not overlooked. Bai Xiaochun was not present, but the Grand Heaven Master and other leaders of the Arch-Emperor dynasty made the same decision as the others, sending celestials and demigods out to search. Meanwhile, Bai Xiaochun was back on his treasured fan, expression somber as he focused on a bit of fire taking shape in front of him. The transformations occurring within this fire were different than in 29-colored flame. It was impossible to see the colors within the flame, as though all of the colors had combined together, making the fire transparent. Bai Xiaochun had already completed the main outline of the formula, and with every test he did, he inched closer to completion. Even still, after all of the failures, Bai Xiaochun was starting to come to the conclusion that success was not a foregone conclusion. He was perfectly prepared, and completely qualified in terms of experience. And yet, every time he tried, there was still a high chance of failure. Does concocting 30-colored flame all come down to luck? He murmured. He had already failed dozens of times, something that would drive most people to despair. After all, every failure involved a huge wastage of souls. Even with the massive stockpile he had built up, it was still a shocking loss. Based on his calculations, he only had enough for about 20 more tries, after which he would be out of souls. During his years traveling in the void, he hadn't collected all of the souls there were to be had, but had definitely acquired a good portion. Whatever scattered souls that still remained in random locations would be very troublesome to track down. I have to make this work. Sighing, he continued to work hard. A few days later, intense rumbling sounds erupted out, and an unsightly expression appeared on Bai Xiaochun's face. After sitting there in a bit of a daze for a while, he started working again. Thus, the days marched by. A month later, he had 8 more failures under his belt, each one seemingly due to a different reason. He still couldn't figure out exactly what the problem was. Another month passed, and he was starting to form the kernel of an idea about what was going on. His next session of conjuring went very smoothly. His heart pounded, and he stopped breathing as he focused completely on his task at hand. His mind emptied of everything, as he concentrated completely on the sea of fire. An unknown amount of time passed. Eventually, he began to regain his faculties, whereupon he found himself looking at a dazzling tongue of flame, floating right there in front of him. 30 colors. Shivering with excitement, he thought back to all of the hard work that had gone into this moment, and what it would be like to resurrect Bai Hao. And then, he started laughing at the top of his lungs. Taking a deep, excited breath, he slowly moved the tongue of 30-colored flame toward the mark on the back of his hand. As he did, Bai Hao's soul began to emit unprecedentedly intense fluctuations. "Howr," he murmured. And with that, he took the 30-colored flame that he had worked hard on for many, many years, and expended immense resources and effort to conjure, and placed it onto the mark. The instant he did, dazzling light erupted out. Years ago, Bai Hao had sacrificed himself to conjure the 22-colored flame that he needed to save Bai Xiaochun from a moment of crisis. In return, Bai Xiaochun paid an enormous price to resurrect Bai Hao from within the mark that had once been all that remained of him. As the light shining off of the mark grew brighter, Bai Xiaochun's nervousness mounted. He stared and stared at it, until finally, the mark rose up off of his hand to float in front of him, and then began to emit soul fluctuations. The fluctuations grew more intense as the image of a soul began to take shape. Even as Bai Xiaochun looked on, it became Bai Hao. "Howr," he breathed excitedly. Bai Hao's eyelids fluttered, and he opened his eyes. Confused at first, his gaze eventually fell onto Bai Xiaochun, and a tremor passed through him. "Master." A wide smile broke out on Bai Xiaochun's face. He had been waiting for many years for this reunion, and the joy caused him to start laughing. Bai Hao's memories were still a bit of a jumble, but when he saw his master, everything seemed fine, and he grew calm. After all, throughout all the years, his master had been his only family. Now that they were back together, everything seemed calm and stable. Gradually, a smile also broke out on Bai Hao's face. Dropping to his knees, he kowtowed 3 times. It's been so long, master. Laughter became warmth, and joy turned into familial love. Eventually, Bai Xiaochun and Bai Hao began to talk, and the words never seemed to end. As Bai Xiaochun bragged, Bai Hao gradually came to understand everything that had happened after he perished. He learned of how the Heavenspan realm had been destroyed, and learned about the eternal immortal domains. He heard of the glories his master had achieved, and how a third mighty nation had risen up because of him. Oh, right, your venerable master is now an Archean. Have you heard of Archeans? There are only 3 in all of the eternal immortal domains. And I'm not just an ordinary Archean. I could easily crush both the vile emperor and the saint emperor. Off to the side, Bai Hao blinked a few times. However, he knew Bai Xiaochun well, and understood what he liked. Eyes shining reverently, he said, Master, you've always been unparalleled under heaven. It doesn't matter where you go, you always cause a big scene. I can't even come close to matching you in that regard. I guess I'll have to do my best to improve. In response to Bai Hao's sincere flattery, Bai Xiaochun laughed. Then he pointed at him and tried to act a bit more serious, although that was difficult. Hao, one of the things I've always liked about you is that you always tell the truth. Not bad at all, Bai Hao chuckled. As long as his master was happy, then he was happy. And the mere thought of everything his master had gone through to resurrect him caused warm feelings to rise up in his heart. At this point, Bai Xiaochun waved his hand, and was about to launch into some more bragging, when all of a sudden, the enormous tower on the mountain inside of the fan face, the one that housed the Tao essence of life and death, suddenly trembled, and began to emit both black and white light. Bai Xiaochun's jaw immediately dropped, and off to the side, Bai Xiaochi cried, the Tao essence of life and death is being absorbed? Heavens! How is this possible? Moments ago, the spirit automaton had been sneering at Bai Xiaochun's bragging, but now, he flew directly toward the Taoist tower of life and death. Bai Xiaochun also hurried over, followed by Bai Hao, both of them looking very serious. Upon entering the face of the fan, Bai Xiaochun sent his divine sense into the tower, where he saw Song Qiu's corpse floating in the air. 2 streams of mist that were formed from the Tao essence of life and death had wrapped around him, and were slowly feeding into his body. He actually got it to work? Bai Xiaochi blurted. No way, that doesn't make sense. Suddenly realizing he was speaking aloud, he gasped and looked over at Bai Xiaochun. Upon realizing that he was completely focused on Song Ke, he breathed a sigh of relief. The truth was that the chances of success were far lower than Bai Xiaochi had indicated years ago. After all, this tower had only been in the initial stages of research by the worldly Taoist. However, now, his theories were proven true. Song Ke, Bai Xiaochun murmured. Although Song Ke still had a profound aura of death, he looked different now, and was clearly turning around from the depths of non-existence. Without a doubt, Song Ke was fusing with the Tao essence of life and death, and if he succeeded, then it was highly likely he would come back to life. Furthermore, his cultivation base would probably be different, although it was impossible to say exactly how. Unfortunately, Bai Xiaochun had no way to determine the details. As for Bai Xiaochi, after he recovered from his initial shock, and realized what Bai Xiaochun was thinking, he quickly provided further input. My lord, this fellow Taoist could very well fuse with the Tao essence itself. Although he can't get the approval of any world, and thus won't be able to become a true sovereign, he will be as powerful as you can get without reaching that level. He will be in the quasi-sovereign realm. However, whether the fusion process goes quickly or slowly will depend on his own good fortune. After all, something like this has never happened before. Bai Xiaochi looked over at Song Ke, mixed emotions on his face. The Tao essence of life and death was the Tao of the worldly Taoist, immortal imperator. If Song Ke succeeded in the fusion process, then in some ways, he would be the true successor of the core Taoist teachings and doctrines of the worldly Taoist. After hearing Bai Xiaochi's explanation, and taking a moment to closely examine Song Ke, Bai Xiaochun's heart leapt with joy. It could be said that Bai Hao had saved Bai Xiaochun's life, but Song Ke had saved the lives of his Taoist partners and unborn children. It was a kindness that Bai Xiaochun would never be able to forget. Eyes shining, he sighed, clasped hands, and bowed to Song Ke. Then he turned and left. In that very moment, the 3 imperial dynasties back in the eternal immortal domains were in the process of hunting down the fallen chunks of stone, and either capturing the living things they found, or destroying them. However, things were not going well. The stones were infected with a sovereign aura, and caused the areas where they landed to rot away. If they were found quickly, the effects could be combated to some extent. Unfortunately, some areas required that a celestial intervene. A month passed, and although many of the stones had been tracked down, all of them were completely solid. Almost none seemed to contain flesh and blood clones of the sovereign above. In fact, so far, only one stone had appeared with a clone in it, and that was in the Saint Emperor dynasty. In one location near the border of the Arch-Emperor dynasty and the Vile Emperor dynasty, the giant Ghost King was flying through the air. As a celestial, he had already taken care of 7 fallen stones, all of which he had either crushed or collected. Right now, he was heading to an area where one of his demigod subordinates had discovered another fallen stone. Thankfully, it was a remote wilderness area where no one lived. Therefore, the effects of the spreading rot were not very detrimental. Furthermore, the giant Ghost King's celestial cultivation base was capable of negating the effects of the rot. As he flew along, the location of the stone itself got closer and closer. After dealing with this stone, I'll head back to the city, he thought, sighing. I'm afraid there are going to be a lot of ramifications to this event. The giant Ghost King's trajectory brought him closer to the border of the Vile Emperor dynasty with every moment. Eventually, he found himself outside of a wide basin in the lands. It wasn't particularly large, but the ground in the area was all scorched black, with wisps of black smoke rising up everywhere. In the middle of the basin was a chunk of stone. It was about the size of a fist, and pulsed with strange, dim light. In fact, the stone itself seemed to shift in size and shape according to some strange pattern. It almost looked like a heartbeat. 8 demigods from the Arch-Emperor dynasty already had the area locked down, but they weren't strong enough to deal with the corrosive powers coming from the stone, and thus, hadn't approached it. After reporting the matter, they had simply waited for the giant Ghost King to arrive. When they saw him nearing, they immediately rose to their feet and offered formal greetings. The giant Ghost King waved his hand in response, and without saying anything, flew right into the basin. The pulses of corrosive power could melt a demigod on the spot, but would not harm a celestial in the short term. However, the giant Ghost King did begin to pulse with black smoke. Aware that the effects could be detrimental if he allowed them to continue for too long, he hurried up to the stone, then reached out and grabbed it. Just as he had with several other stones that he had handled, he scanned it with divine sense at the same time. As he did, his expression flickered, and his eyes went wide. It's not solid. To his shock, his divine sense had revealed something inside of the stone that resembled an unborn lizard. Even as the giant Ghost King scanned it with divine sense, the thing wriggled. At first, the giant Ghost King was excited to have found something different from the other stones he had encountered so far. Aware of how valuable this item was, he immediately turned to head toward Arch-Emperor City. However, in that very instant, a cold snort echoed out from the sky, which transformed the entire area into a sea of flames. The black fire moved too quickly for the demigods to avoid, and they screamed as they were overwhelmed and transformed into ash. Vile Emperor. The giant Ghost King growled. He had watched Bai Xiaochun fighting the Vile Emperor, and over the years, had conferred with Gongsun Wan'er about him. As such, as soon as his senses told him the Vile Emperor was present, he immediately sent a warning message to Arch-Emperor City. Unfortunately, the sea of flames moved so quickly that within moments, it was like an enormous hand, wrapping around the giant Ghost King. No matter how he tried to fight back or flee, his cultivation base was simply too low. Therefore, the hand wrapped around him and dragged him forcibly up into the sky. There, the Vile Emperor hovered, clad in imperial robes, his hands clasped behind his back and his face completely expressionless. Ignoring the hand of flames, he focused on the stone, which he grabbed and looked at closely. Shockingly, he then absorbed the stone into his hand, whereupon his eyes shone with bizarre light, and his aura increased in power by a significant portion. Still within the hand of flames was the giant Ghost King, blood oozing out of his eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. He was so badly injured that he was now unconscious. Eventually, the Vile Emperor looked at him, then turned his gaze in the direction of Arch-Emperor City. Eyes narrowing, he coolly murmured, "Many years have passed, Bai Xiaochun. Do you really possess Archean battle prowess?" Considering how much time had passed without Bai Xiaochun actually doing anything, both he and the Saint Emperor were having a hard time determining the truth of matters. In the past, Bai Xiaochun had relied on Archean luminescence. But in the years that had passed, the Vile Emperor had patiently worked on a way to negate its effects. And now, convinced that great matters were at hand, he was itching to see exactly what was going on with Bai Xiaochun. Chuckling, he grabbed the giant Ghost King and then flew away. Soon after, a dharmic decree was sent from Vile Emperor all the way to Arch-Emperor City. The contents were not vague. the giant Ghost King had trespassed on Vile Emperor Dynasty territory and attempted to steal a meteorite. For his crime, the Vile Emperor had captured him to be punished. The Dharmic decree was a clear message to all of the eternal immortal domains that the Vile Emperor wanted Bai Xiaochun to go to Vile Emperor City to free the giant Ghost King. It was impossible to hide the fact that he wanted to probe Bai Xiaochun, and it caused even the Saint Emperor's eyes to narrow. On the one hand, he and Bai Xiaochun had formed an alliance, but on the other hand, he had long suspected that Bai Xiaochun's true battle prowess was weaker than he had initially taken it to be. Therefore, this little test by the Vile Emperor was actually a good thing for him. Some probing won't hurt me, but if Bai Xiaochun perishes, that will have negative ramifications. Therefore, the Saint Emperor decided to monitor the situation closely and prepare to intervene if necessary. 3 days passed, and no response came from Arch-Emperor City. The Vile Emperor's suspicions deepened, as did the suspicions of his people. Meanwhile, the important figures in Arch-Emperor City began to get nervous, people like Zhou Zimo and the Grand Heaven Master. They all knew that the Vile Emperor was testing out Bai Xiaochun, and that if he didn't make an appearance, that it would reveal their weak state of power. And if Bai Xiaochun was truly weak, or they waited too long to do something, the giant Ghost King would likely be in grave danger. At that point, Song Junwan, Zhou Zimo and Hu Xiaomei went to Bai Xiaochun's secluded meditation facilities, joined by the Grand Heaven Master and Gongsun Wan'er. Together, they sent out divine scents in the hopes of awakening Bai Xiaochun from his meditative trance. However, their divine scents got no reaction. Even as their anxiety began to mount, the door to the chamber swung open, and Bai Xiaochun appeared. However, everyone could immediately tell that he was partially transparent, and was obviously a clone. Before any of them could say anything, he said, "I'm aware of what's happening. My true self is already on his way." Then, he suddenly began to shine with bright light. Everyone, from the Grand Heaven Master to Gongsun Wan'er, were shaken by that light, which was blinding even to celestials. As the light grew brighter, everyone present shivered down to their souls, the result of a powerful aura that caused their minds to reel. Before long, the light began to converge into the shape of a person. It was almost like a teleportation as Bai Xiaochun's true self materialized in the exact spot as his clone. As he became clear, they realized that he looked different. His hair was a bit longer, and he actually looked younger. However, there was something profound about his eyes, as though they contained stars, and at the same time, were black holes that could drag anything and everything into them. His eyes left everyone shaken, regardless of the level of their cultivation bases, including even Gongsun Wan'er, who was in the late celestial realm. Back during his journey through the void, he would usually keep his aura out in the open, and although he had already retracted it, his clone had made him aware of what the Vile Emperor had done to the giant Ghost King. And thus, rage burned in his heart, and some of his aura managed to slip out, leading to shock among those present. The shaken Grand Heaven Master was the first to recover. Clasping hands, he bowed to Bai Xiaochun. "Greetings, Arch-Emperor." Everyone else followed suit, including Song Junwan, Zhou Zimo, and Hu Xiaomei. "Greetings, Arch-Emperor. I'll take care of everything," he said, his eyes warm. "Don't worry." Zhou Zimo, Song Junwan and Hu Xiaomei all seemed to relax visibly, confident that he could resolve any difficulties. It had been a long time since the last time they had reunited, so he took time to embrace all three of his wives. Song Junwan was smiling warmly, and Hu Xiaomei's belly was already visibly large. However, the both of them knew that Zhou Zimo had taken her father's kidnapping worse than the two of them, and secretly indicated that he should offer her some comfort. When he turned his gaze to her specifically, he could see how red her eyes were. "I'm going to go get father-in-law back," he said softly, "and also make the Vile Emperor dynasty pay for this. After I return, I won't be going into secluded meditation for a while." With that, he blurred into motion, shooting high up into the sky. Bai Xiaochun had returned right into the middle of a tense situation. The matter with the giant Ghost King had occurred without any warning, and if matters had been left only to the clone he left behind, then it was impossible to say what could have happened. Thankfully, Bai Xiaochun had finally finished several important tasks. Bai Hao had been resurrected, Song Ke was showing signs of waking up, and Bai Xiaochun's cultivation base was now in the Archean realm. His fight with the old ghost woman, and his regular sparring sessions with his two Archean slaves, had pushed his battle prowess to the point where he was now much more confident than before. If his enemy were not the Vile Emperor, Bai Xiaochun would have simply attacked like lightning, crushed him, and taken the giant Ghost King back. But he had learned years ago that this Vile Emperor was an impostor, and considering what he had learned from the memories of the worldly Taoist, he had long since come to a conclusion about the matter. This imposter Vile Emperor definitely has something to do with the mortal renegade, Devil Imperator. As Bai Xiaochun whistled through the air, his eyes were narrowed with thought, but soon, they would be bursting with killing intent. It didn't matter what techniques the Vile Emperor had up his sleeve, Bai Xiaochun knew that at this moment, he had no other choice than to fight. Otherwise, the giant Ghost King would be in peril. And besides, the Vile Emperor would never stop probing him. Bai Xiaochun remembered how, back when his children had been born, the Vile Emperor had given him a gift in the form of some sovereign blood, encased in a black stone. The sense of danger he had experienced from that stone had enraged him back then, but he had been forced to do nothing. Now, new grudges piled on top of old ones, causing his killing intent to grow even stronger. Rumbling sounds echoed around him as he left Arch-Emperor Dynasty territory and entered the lands of the Vile Emperor Dynasty. Considering the speed he was capable of, it didn't take long before he saw an enormous trident rising up into the sky ahead of him, around which was wrapped a bone dragon. On the skull of that dragon was none other than the Imperial Palace. Vile Emperor, he growled, his voice echoing like heavenly thunder. Everything shook in response to his words, and all of the cultivators in Vile Emperor City, even the Celestials, looked up in shock. It's the Arch-Emperor. Everyone in the city knew that the Vile Emperor had taken the giant Ghost King captive, and were also aware of his dharmic decree, demanding that the Arch-Emperor Bai Xiaochun come to free his subordinate. Although some of them were slightly worried about what might happen, most of them were excited, and were convinced that Bai Xiaochun was no match for their Vile Emperor. After all, it was only by teaming up with the Saint Emperor that Bai Xiaochun had managed to fight the Vile Emperor to a standstill years before. This time, the Vile Emperor had dared to take the initiative, and therefore, everyone assumed that he was well prepared. However, all such confidence began to crumble as soon as people heard Bai Xiaochun's booming voice. As the city trembled physically, black smoke erupted from a certain location within the Imperial Palace, rising up into the sky to take the shape of a huge face. Bai Xiaochun, the face said, its voice thrumming with an awe-inspiring force that was the perfect countermeasure to Bai Xiaochun. Anyone else would have been forced to slow down, but not Bai Xiaochun. Eyes flashing with cold light, he said, "Where'd you get guts like that, Vile Emperor? If you want to back out on our agreement, fine, but how dare you kidnap my father-in-law?" He waved his hand, and instantly, 8 beams of Archean luminescence appeared up above and shot toward the Vile Emperor's projected face. They didn't mince words. Bai Xiaochun had come to fight, a fact which was revealed by how he instantly called on his Archean luminescence. In response, the Vile Emperor's eyes shone with mysterious light, and a snide smile appeared on his face. "Is that the only thing you can do, Bai Xiaochun?" The enormous face distorted as 9 bright lights appeared within the smoke. Closer inspection revealed that the lights were 9 huge crystals, which sent tendrils out to connect to each other, quickly becoming an enormous black mirror. The mirror formed almost as soon as the Archean luminescence arrived. However, the booming explosion everyone anticipated didn't occur. Strangely, the mirror acted like a mass of sludge, which simply swallowed up the Archean luminescence. "If that's all you've got," the Vile Emperor said coolly, "then I have to say I'm very disappointed." He strode out from his palace and floated up into the air, coming to a stop in front of the crystal mirror, his Archean aura raging. Of course, a big cheer could be heard from within Vile Emperor City, and numerous cultivators stepped forward and clasped hands in greeting. Bai Xiaochun didn't say anything in response to seeing the mirror formed from 9 crystals. Waving his right hand, he summoned 10 more beams of Archean luminescence, all of which shot directly toward the Vile Emperor. "That won't work," the Vile Emperor said, keeping his hands clasped behind his back, a faint smile visible on his face. "I already created the perfect counter to your Archean luminescence. You won't be able to break my vile imperial crystals." The illusory mirror suddenly shot forward, passing through him to block all of the shots of Archean luminescence. Rumbling booms could be heard as the Archean luminescence faded away, with the mirror remaining behind, seemingly undamaged. "That's almost 20, Bai Xiaochun. Do you have any more shots left? I'm very curious to see how many you have in total." The Vile Emperor still had not removed his hands from behind his back, and his smile continued to radiate scorn. Because this Vile Emperor was connected to the mortal renegade in some way, Bai Xiaochun knew that no matter how much he wanted to fight him, he had to be careful. Therefore, he kept his cultivation base well concealed, making it seem to the Vile Emperor that he was still a celestial. Not even the Vile Emperor's taunts could get him to reveal his true cultivation base. Besides, he had plenty of trump cards to call upon, so unless the Vile Emperor truly attacked him with force, he would not draw upon the full level of his battle prowess. "You wanna see? Fine. I'll show you how many shots I have. Chuckling, he performed an incantation gesture with his right hand and then waved his finger, causing the sky to tremble as more than 50 beams of light appeared. Everyone in Vile Emperor City was shocked by that, and began to cry out in alarm. So many, heavens! Wasn't everyone saying that the Arch-Emperor only had about 20 shots of his Archean luminescence? In contrast, the Vile Emperor didn't seem to be alarmed. Although he was surprised, he was still confident, and simply watched as the 50 beams of Archean luminescence shot toward his black mirror. Intense rumbling sounds could then be heard as the light was absorbed by the mirror, which still seemed just as tough and durable as before. The Vile Emperor burst out laughing. So, that's your limit, huh? Well, however, before he could say anything else, Bai Xiaochun waved his hand again. This time, 100 beams of light appeared up above. It was such a shocking scene that even the Vile Emperor's eyes went wide, and his mind began to spin. And yet, before anyone could wrap their minds around what was happening, Bai Xiaochun performed another incantation gesture, causing another group of more than 100 beams to appear. In total, there were now 267 beams. And if anyone had been closely counting how many shots he had already used, they would realize that it was a total of 361. That was exactly how many playing spots existed on the Go board on the boat in the fan face, and was the true limit of the divine ability. Right now, nearly 300 beams of Archean luminescence were causing all heaven and earth to tremble. 1. Impossible, the Vile Emperor breathed, visibly shaken. It wasn't just him. In the Saint Emperor dynasty, the Saint Emperor was watching the battle play out, and was also completely taken aback. You said you wanted to see how much I could do at once, right, Vile Emperor? Waving both hands out in front of him, Bai Xiaochun sent nearly 300 shots of Archean luminescence toward the Vile Emperor like a rain of bright light. The Vile Emperor's eyes were completely bloodshot as his black mirror began to expand to its full limit. It did everything in its power to hold firm as one beam of light after another pierced into it. However, it didn't matter how durable and tough the mirror was, it simply couldn't stand up to so much Archean luminescence, and soon, cracks were spreading out over its surface. After it blocked about 80% of the incoming shots of Archean luminescence, it couldn't hold on any longer, and shattered into countless fragments. As for the 9 vile imperial crystals that the Vile Emperor had toiled so hard to make, and had even used his own life force to forge, they were all destroyed. As that happened, a deafening boom erupted out, shaking nearly half of the eternal immortal domains. It almost looked like doomsday had arrived as a massive shockwave rolled out across the lands, toppling mountains, smashing the lands, and even threatening to cleave apart the sky. 361 beams of Archean luminescence was an outrageous number. Everyone present to see it happen felt their mind reeling, and those who had often wondered about how many shots Bai Xiaochun actually had were now completely blown away. I can't believe he has so many. How is that even possible? Heavens, more than 300? Either the Arch-Emperor has gotten stronger, or he never got pushed to the point of actually calling upon the full power of his trump card before. There were too many shocked individuals in the Vile Emperor dynasty to count. As for the Saint Emperor dynasty, it was only the Saint Emperor and the Celestials who could observe the battle via divine sense. However, all of them were also completely astonished. That was especially true of the Saint Emperor. Never could he have guessed that Bai Xiaochun would have so much Archean luminescence. More than 300 shots was enough to shake heaven and earth, and would be enough to force him to fall back. At the same time, he had gone all out in fighting the Vile Emperor in the past. But now, the Vile Emperor seemed much stronger than he had before. For example, his Vile Imperial crystals seemed capable of defending against just about any divine ability in the Archean realm. The Saint Emperor would have been forced to pay a heavy price to destroy those crystals, and would also have been injured in the process. How could both of them have gotten so strong, so quickly? Meanwhile, the Vile Emperor hovered in the air above Vile Emperor City, feeling very unsettled as he glared murderously at Bai Xiaochun. It had never occurred to him that Bai Xiaochun could possibly command so much Archean luminescence, and if he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he would still believe it to be impossible. At this point, he shouldn't have any more, he thought, eyes glittering. He had originally just wanted to probe Bai Xiaochun a bit, only to provoke killing intent within him. However, he was now fairly convinced that since Bai Xiaochun didn't have any Archean luminescence, he shouldn't be very difficult to kill. From what he could see, Bai Xiaochun was still in the celestial realm. Because of the level of Bai Xiaochun's cultivation base, and how he had been blessed by the essence of time, not even the Vile Emperor was able to see his true level. Bai Xiaochun knew that it was only a matter of time before that changed, and yet, he didn't care. He would reveal the truth eventually, and only hoped to force his opponent to lose some of his advantage by making certain moves too soon. When the time came that the vile emperor realized the truth, Bai Xiaochun would attack with utterly devastating force. I'm willing to bet that you have no more Archean luminescence, Bai Xiaochun. The vile emperor then threw his head back and roared. Although he had no more vile imperial crystals, he had many other trump cards, reserves built up over many years. Besides, he was in Vile Emperor City. Therefore, he performed an incantation gesture with his right hand, and pointed down at the city below. As he did, the enormous bone dragon that was wrapped around the gigantic trident suddenly shivered. At the same time, two balls of black flame appeared in the eyes of the skull that housed the imperial palace. Along with the flame came a heaven-shaking, earth-shattering aura from the dragon's body itself, and a force of vibration that caused the sky to grow dim, and massive winds to spring up. The dragon itself was massive, and was the foundation of Vile Emperor City itself. Therefore, as it vibrated, the buildings that made up the city began to collapse, and countless cultivators were thrown off of the body. Millions and millions of cultivators were shocked to the core as they were ejected from the city. Then, to their shock, the bone dragon looked up, let loose a deafening howl, and then shot off of the trident and into the air. It was a huge dragon, and now that the buildings that had once covered it were destroyed, it was possible to see something like a crown on its head, as if this bone dragon were actually an emperor among dragons. It was incomparably fierce, with a towering aura of death. The black flames in its eyes were ferocious and cold, and it was heart-stoppingly shocking as it hovered there in the air. Then, the vile emperor performed an incantation gesture, and the dragon shot toward Bai Xiaochun. As it flew toward him, the air around it shattered, destroyed by the mere pressure emanating from the dragon. Archean dragon, Bai Xiaochun thought, pupils constricting. The aura coming from the bone dragon was indeed that of the Archean realm. This was one of the vile emperor's trump cards. In order to kill Bai Xiaochun, he was even willing to destroy Vile Emperor City. Back when Bai Xiaochun was a celestial, if he had faced this dragon with no Archean luminescence, he would have been completely powerless to fight back. He could only have gone all out to flee. But now, he didn't seem worried at all. Instead of flinching, his eyes shone with strange light as he lifted up both hands and performed an incantation gesture. Sutra of Former Reincarnation. In that instant, a strange and indescribable aura shot out into the open, causing the Vile Emperor's expression to flicker. This was not his first time seeing Bai Xiaochun unleash this strange magic, but this time, something about it seemed different. Even as the Vile Emperor looked on suspiciously, the bone dragon shivered as numerous magical symbols appeared on its body. In the blink of an eye, they covered the entire dragon, making it impossible to count how many they were. Within moments, they were like a huge net that completely covered the Archean dragon. Each and every one of the magical symbols that made up the huge net represented a memory, and by gazing at them for long enough, it was possible to see things that had happened when the dragon was alive. This was the Sutra of Former Reincarnation, one of the three great divine abilities of Bai Xiaochun's time immemorial codex. With his previous cultivation base, it had been difficult to utilize the true power of his three divine abilities. But now he didn't face that obstacle. And thus, he was using the true sealing power of the Sutra of Former Reincarnation. The bone dragon's memories became magical symbols that could not be separated, and became karma, sealing the dragon completely. Seal, Bai Xiaochun said, his voice as cold as the winter wind. Meanwhile, the dragon shrieked miserably, and struggled in vain to free itself. However, it didn't matter how shockingly powerful the dragon was, as the net of magical symbols tightened, it was completely powerless. To the shock of all of the observing cultivators who had once lived in Vile Emperor City, the magical symbols began to crush the Archean bone dragon into a ball. When the process was finished, rumbling sounds could be heard as the sphere of magical symbols emanated colorful light, dropped down to the ground, and remained there unmoving. Heavens! The Arch-Emperor actually sealed the bone dragon. This is impossible. Even the Vile Emperor had forgotten to breathe, and was looking at Bai Xiaochun with narrowed eyes. You're not a celestial, but you couldn't possibly be an Archean. At that point, Bai Xiaochun looked up, his aura surging to reveal his boundless Archean cultivation base. Heaven and earth trembled, and winds screamed. As countless voices cried out in shock, he shot toward the Vile Emperor like an arrow loosed from a bow. Booms rang out as, over the course of only a few breaths worth of time, the two of them exchanged hundreds of blows. The lands quaked and the air shattered, and back in Saint Emperor City, the Saint Emperor City looked on with wide eyes, completely mind-blown. He actually became an Archean? That's impossible. The Eternal Mother is asleep. If she approved of another Archean, then she would have announced it to all of the eternal immortal domains. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.